Καλησπέρα σας. Καλώς ορίσατε στην απόψινή μας βραδιά, που είναι για την άλωση της Ελληνικής. Με ονομάζομαι Γεωργία Παπαδοπούλου, είμαι εκπαιδευτικός και θα παρουσιάσω το πρόγραμμα της απόψινής βραδιάς. Θα ξεκινήσουμε με ένα κομμάτι από την αυθεντική σύνθεση, το Original Composition of the City Has Fallen, του κύριου Μάικ Σάβα. Θα κάνω μια εισαγωγή μικρή στα αγγλικά. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mike Savas. Born in Athens, Greece, Mike is a UNESCO-awarded artist, songwriter, guitarist, and jura player with a truly unique sound. His music brings together the power of heavy rock with the soul of Greek rebetiko and the colors of world music. In his solo performances, you will hear original, partly improvised pieces that blend the old and the new, traditional tones with a modern twist. Mike is also a member of Porphyria, the musical project behind 3 albums and the Grecian rock opera, which has taken the stage at Carnegie Hall, off-Broadway at the Players Theatre and Flushing Town Hall. Get ready for the performance that's powerful and deeply authentic. Here is Mike Savas. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce a truly distinguished individual, a visionary in construction, a respected community leader, and a proud champion of Hellenic heritage. With over 5 decades of experience in New York's real estate development, design and construction management industry, Louis Katsos is widely recognized as a leader in his field. His work has been instrumental in shaping the landscape of the New York metropolitan area through numerous major ground-up projects. Mr. Katsos is the president and founder of the East Mediterranean Business Culture Alliance, known as EMBCA, and serves as vice president and executive board member at the Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce. He's an ardent deputakos of the Ecumenical Patriarchy and a member of the Hellenic Initiative's Lord Byron Circle. Among his many accomplishments, he played a significant role in the rebuilding of the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church, a national shrine at Ground Zero, a project of profound national and spiritual significance. A passionate advocate of Hellenic culture, Mr. Katsos has served as National Hellenic Cultural Commission Chairman, District Governor of New York of AHEPA, and President of the American Hellenic Initiative's New York chapter. He co-chaired New York's Greek Independence Parade in both 2020 and 2022, and is chosen to serve as chairman of the parade in 2026. He has many honors, including the Face of the Diaspora Award during the bicentennial of the Hellenic Revolution and the Who's Who International Award of Eminence in Global Real Estate and Construction Management. He is the former executive vice president of the Hellenic American Chamber of Commerce and also hosted a program on Cosmos FM Hellenic Public Radio. An accomplished educator, thought leader, and lecturer, Mr. Katsos spent over nearly 30 years as an adjunct professor, assistant professor at NYU, and at the Channing School of Architecture at Cooper Union. Today, he continues to inform and inspire through his role as moderator of the acclaimed New York Development Design and Construction and EMBCA panel series. Mr. Katsos holds both a Bachelor of Engineering Civil Engineer and an MBA from New York University. Please join me in welcoming a man whose contributions span business, education, culture, and community, Mr. Louis Katsos.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I regard this actually as a first in a series of different discussions as we approach the 2026 parade. And this one's going to be on the fall of Constantinople, but we're going to have a lot of them relating, obviously, to the Hellenic Revolution. The fall of Constantinople on May 29th, 1453, marked the end of the East Roman Empire and signaled the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a dominant power in southeastern Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. The event was not sudden. It was a catastrophe, but it was a culmination of centuries of decline, religious division, and military encirclement. It was also the beginning of a legacy of resistance, of memory, and national revival that culminated in the Hellenic Revolution of 1821, 4 centuries later. My presentation today will explore the long road to 1453, the decisive siege itself, and the profound impact on the city's fall and world history, with attention to the roles of the Fourth Crusade, the Council of Florence, the Despotate of Misclas, the Trebizond, and the Orthodox world's enduring response. Let's talk a little bit about that decline that we were talking about. Once the crown jewel of Christendom, Constantinople had by the 15th century become a shell of its former self. The East Roman Empire's collapse was not abrupt. It was long, painful erosion precipitated by both internal weakness and external pressures. Let's take a look at some maps. So the first map is the Roman Empire in 330, when Constantine the Great inaugurated Constantinople. Take a look at this, it's absolutely amazing. 5 years later, don't forget, they had the Council of Nicaea. And when Constantine was there, this was the empire, the Roman Empire. This is the empire that Constantine controlled. A few years later, in 395, the Roman Empire was divided between East and West. That's why from then on, historically, it is known as the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire expanded to a certain degree during Justinian's reign, and this particular map is of 565. By 1025, it had shrunk, and this was the last year of Basil II's reign. Notice the empire. Okay, we're talking about most of what is now modern Turkey, most of what is now Hellas, most of now what is the Balkans, Croatia, all the rest of that, and obviously southern Italy that you see in behind. By 1203, right before the Fourth Crusade, this was basically the empire. It shrunk a little bit. And this is during Isaac II's Angelos' reign at the throne. One of the greatest blows came not from Islam, but the Latin invasion during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. So here in this particular map, okay, which is the governments in exile after the Fourth Crusade took over, you see basically three kingdoms. Okay, what was before one empire, now you see three kingdoms. You have over here Dimitrios, you have Nicaea, and you have Helvetia. Okay, these were the three pieces that were left of the Eastern Roman Empire. The rest of these pieces were taken over basically by the Western nations. So, for example, those of you obviously who are from Hellas, Crete was taken over by the Venetians. The Ionian Islands, the same thing. Other islands were taken over by the Genoese and others. And this particular area that is in white fell into different regimes and different rules. And this is what we call the period of the Latins in the Levant. For those of you who are very interested in this, I recommend you read Miller's The Latins in the Levant, which explains the Western influence on Greece and the Balkans during this particular time. So even though the Ottomans were there for about 400 years, the Western powers were there actually longer than 400 years. Okay, don't forget that, for example, the Ionian Islands, which were taken over by Venice, didn't become part of Greece till 1864, for example. Obviously, the French had it for a little while during the Napoleonic Wars, and then it was taken over by the British in the early 1800s. So originally intended to reclaim Jerusalem, the crusade was diverted to Constantinople. At the time, the leader was actually Doge Dandolo. Doge Dandolo, he was the Doge of Venice. And he basically hated Constantinople. And he basically diverted them and, gave them a good idea. What happened? Why did they divert it? They had commissioned from Venice ships to go into Jerusalem. But the Venetians didn't have the money, to pay for the ships. So Doge Dandolo came up with a great idea that, why not, go and get some money from certain other places. So they invaded Zara, which is over here in the Dalmatian area. And then he took the fleet actually into Jerusalem under the guise that they were going to restore a former emperor. Okay, this was all a guise. They went in there basically, burned a third of the city, and in the largest sack in the world in history was the sack of Constantinople in 1204. So the initial sack was that they occupied the area. This event shattered This event shattered the political, economic, and religious cohesion of the empire. What do I mean by the religious cohesion? When these Western powers came in and took over Constantinople during that period of time, they imposed the Latin Rite and they took over all the churches. So, for example, Hagia Sophia was for a period of time under Latin rule. And it wasn't an Orthodox cathedral, it was actually a Roman Catholic cathedral. So the Latin Empire, established in Constantinople, lasted until 1861. And I will say one thing, because this is kind of a personal thing. When I went to Constantinople the first time, I visited obviously many places, and certainly I visited also Hagia Sophia. Originally, Dodge Gondola was buried in Hagia Sophia, and as a matter of fact, there's a plaque. If you go to Hagia Sophia to the balcony, you'll see a plaque that has where he was buried originally. And one of the things that I did, and I continue to do every time I go to Constantinople, is basically spit on the tombstone of Dodge Gondola. That's just a personal thing. So with this particular thing, even though they came back in 1261, the Byzantines, or the Roman, or the Eastern Romans, never fully recovered their strength. They never fully recovered their strength. The empire was permanently weakened, both materially and psychologically. Constantinople's infrastructure was devastated, relics and treasures were looted, and they went all over the Western world. If you go into Venice, for example, you'll find the horses that used to be in a hippodrome. Okay, so a lot of the relics, and Constantinople has more relics than any other place in the world. A lot of them were scattered throughout Europe. And the schism became permanent during this particular thing between the Orthodox East and the Roman Catholic West. And it was deepened by the violence of fellow Christians. This is important because many times in Western history they talk about 1054 as being the Great Schism. Okay, this is what we were taught in school. But in reality, the Orthodox never acknowledged 1054 during that period. It was 1204 that caused the real split psychologically between the East and the West in terms of religion. In the vacuum that followed, several successive states emerged, as we said. The Empire of Nicaea. They were the ones which eventually reclaimed Constantinople. And then you had the Empire of Trebizond that really continued until about 1461, which I'll describe in a second, on the Black Sea. And later on, of course, the Despotate of the Morea, okay, in the Peloponnese. Although Nicaea succeeded in retaking the city, it really did not restore the empire's dominance. Okay, this photo shows around the period of 1262, when they came back, when the Mycenaeans basically recaptured the area and reestablished the empire. As you see in the Peloponnesus, you see only the area around Laconia. You see the area around Laconia, because all these other areas that we're talking about were still with the Western powers, still with the people who descended from the Fourth Crusade. By the 14th century, a new and formidable power emerged in Anatolia and the Balkans, the Ottoman Turks. Under leaders such as Murad I and Bayezid I, the Ottomans expanded aggressively into Europe, defeating Serbian, Bulgarian, and East Roman, or let's say Hellenic, forces. Although the catastrophic Ottoman defeat by Timberlane in the Battle of Ankara in 1402 temporarily delayed the expansion, the respite for Constantinople was short-lived. By the time Mehmed II came to power in 1451, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than the city of Constantinople and the surrounding area. And of course you had Moria, and of course you had Trebizond. Okay, so this is around the time of 1453. As you see, only this area really existed at that particular time. The Ottomans had taken over these areas, the Ottomans had taken over all those areas, and you had Pepperzone, of course, was still there, and the Despotat of the Moria. Okay, the Despotat of the Moria. I'll show you this other photo, which also, bear with me, okay, which shows basically the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. And as you see in the early days, here's in a different language, unfortunately, but here's the expansion. So they expanded from these areas, went into what is now mainland Greece, eventually went into obviously all the Balkan areas until they were stopped in Vienna in 1683. Mehmed immediately prepared for siege once he became the Sultan. He ordered the construction of the Rumeli Hisari, a massive fortress on the Bosphorus directly across from the earlier Andalu Hisari. In other words, he built basically fortifications along the Bosphorus, basically cutting off Constantinople from any aid by the sea. He hired the Hungarian engineer Urban, who constructed a massive cannons, including the legendary basilica. When you saw the first photo, and you saw that photo of that gigantic cannon, that was the basilica, capable of launching 600-pound stone balls at the walls. I want to go back a little bit before the final collapse of the empire, and just discuss what took place a little bit before that, and the tensions, the Roman Catholic tensions, and the Orthodox division based on the Council of Florence, because it becomes very important to why, in particular, the city fell the way it did. For centuries, tensions had simmered between the East Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, formalized in the eyes by the West only of the Great Schism of 1054, but really what I said, 1204. And the animosity intensified with the Fourth Crusade, when the schism actually took hold, and with the Latin occupation of Constantinople, during which the Catholic Crusaders looted these Orthodox churches, desecrated relics, and this created a profound distrust between the Latin West and the Hellenic Orthodox faithful. With the Ottoman threat growing constantly and desperate for military aid against the Ottomans, the Romi sought help from the West. Emperor John the Seventh, Palaeologos, attended the Council of Florence, which took place between 1438 and 1439, a little bit before the fall of Constantinople. It was a major ecclesiastical gathering intended to unite the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. Many times we don't talk about the Council of Florence. I don't know why, but it's a very important event, and it really figures into the fall of Constantinople. After long negotiations, the emperor and other Hellenic delegates signed the Decree of Union. It was called the Latentor Cieli, affirming papal primacy and key Latin doctrines. Okay, what do I mean by Latin doctrines? In other words, some of the things that we had issues with theologically, it was agreed that they had the primacy, and we agreed with them, including issues of the Philorique and all the rest of that things that we are taught. Okay, so on July the 6th, 1439, the Union was proclaimed in both Latin and Greek, in the document that we talked about. And the document that's here is really in English, Let the Heavens Rejoice, which was signed by Pope Eugene and the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaeologos. Note who signed it for the Orthodox Church, because at the time, don't forget, the emperors of Constantinople, the emperors of the empire, were to a certain degree in charge of everything, because this was a theocratic state. When we think of governments, we think of the separation of church and state. There was really no separation of church and state when we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire. It was one and the same. To be a Romeo, you were Orthodox. The aim was clear, to achieve unity, to secure military aid from Western Christendom. However, the union was deeply unpopular in the East. Many Orthodox clergy and laymen saw the agreement as a betrayal. Mark of Ephesus, a leading theologian, refused to sign the decree and became a national hero for his defiance. I'm mentioning these things because I want to bring you to the point where we're talking about in 1453. Understand there were tremendous divisions. People were against the Council of Florence. By the time of the siege of 1453, the union really remained a dead letter in practice. While Emperor Constantine the 11th, who was John VIII's brother and successor, nominally upheld it, the local population refused to accept Latin clergy or recognize papal authority. Western Europe too. We said, okay, we're going to unite so we can get the help. All right. Western Europe offered little beyond token support, very little support, regardless of what anybody says. Religious disunity left the Romani isolated, spiritually fragmented, and without the united Christian front it had hoped to mobilize. It's very difficult to mobilize people if you feel you're going to mobilize them and then someone else is going to take over your religion. Emperor Constantinople, the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was, of course, the brother of John that we mentioned earlier. And he was also the head of the despotat of the Moria. The Paloloyi were really in the Moria, which itself was a major place. It had major military and major lands during that particular time. People don't like to talk about, but in my opinion, in the opinion of many, the Moria, the despotat of the Moria, in many ways was more powerful in terms of people to mobilize, to fight, etc., than Constantinople itself was. So, Sultan Mehmed, here's a portrait of Sultan Mehmed by Bologna. Sultan Mehmed, meanwhile, masterfully exploited the deep religious rift between the East Orthodox Christians and the Roman Catholics to consolidate Ottoman control during and after, really, the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Rather than, after, actually, let me talk a little bit after, and I'll talk about a little bit before. Rather than suppressing the local population or attempting forced conversions in the beginning, obviously it took place later, and forget about the Janissaries, which we'll talk about in a second, he understood that the long-standing suspicion and the hostility that the Orthodox had with the Latin Church. Don't forget, Mehmed II, many people don't realize that, was actually, his mother was Orthodox. I don't know if people realize that, but the mother of Mehmed was Orthodox. And not only that, but Mehmed himself was able to read Greek. I don't know if you know this, but he had an ancient text that he used to read, and he used to even have a notebook where he used to write next to the ancient text. So he actually spoke the Hellenic language. He was just not Turkish. He also spoke the Hellenic language. And he especially understood the problems of the church, especially after the aftermath of the Council of Florence in 1439. And he used it really to his advantage. The final siege of Constantinople that took place in April 6th, began in April 6th of 1453. Mehmed's army numbered over 80,000 troops, vastly outnumbering the city's 7,000 defenders. Think about this. Constantinople had great walls, but had only 7,000 defenders, which included, obviously, Hellenic soldiers, but also Italian mercenaries and a Venetian naval contingent under Giovanni Longo, a skilled Genovese commander. So many of the fighters that were there fighting were actually Western fighters that came in, mercenaries that were helping. Many of the people who could have picked up arms didn't in fact do it for reasons that we are mentioning, and I hope you understand what I'm saying. But this is the interesting part. Mehmed's army consisted of various Christian auxiliaries and mercenaries, estimated to be about 5,000. So even though people talk about Mehmed, he came in with the Ottomans, etc., he also had Christian troops that came with him to actually attack the city. These are some of the Christian troops, from the Ottoman vassal states and territories under Ottoman control at the same time. They included Serbians. Okay, the Serbian despot Brankovic, though officially neutral and or reluctantly cooperative, probably provided some troops under obligation. There were Bulgarians who were Orthodox. There were Vlachs who were Orthodox. There were Albanians who were Orthodox also. Many people think of the Albanians, for example, as not originally being Orthodox, but when you look at the maps that I showed you earlier, they were part of the Eastern Roman Empire for centuries. Some of these were already incorporated into the Ottoman provincial armies, actually. In terms of Western mercenaries with Mehmed, they included some Hungarians, some Italians, they included German auxiliary experts and engineers, including Urban that we mentioned before, the cannon builder, who worked for the Ottomans. Urban had gone to Palaiologos earlier, by the way, and asked him to produce the cannons, but Palaiologos either didn't have the money or didn't want to, and then he went to Mehmed. And then, of course, we had the Janissaries, the Janissaries that were part of Mehmed's troops, and it's estimated there were about 10,000 of them, and they were ethnically and culturally, for the most part, of the Orthodox origin. Many may have been also, even though they were Janissaries, they may have been Orthodox believing, even though they were part of the Ottoman Empire. If we include the Christian-born Janissaries as a distinct category, the number of Christian origin troops in Mehmed's army rises to about 15,000. Though not all of them were practicing Christians by 1453, but many of them still were. This means that roughly almost 20% of the army that took Constantinople may have been of Christian origin. As a matter of fact, there were more Christians in his army than there were defending the city. And with most likely still many of them Orthodox Christians in religion. The irony that Orthodox Christians helped conquer the most important city of the East underscores the complexity of the Ottoman military structure and the fractured state of Christendom at the time. The city's legendary Theodosian walls had repelled invaders for over 1,000 years. The only time, obviously, they were breached were in 1204 that I mentioned earlier. But new technology, especially Mehmed's artillery, began to change the calculus. The massive cannons battered the walls daily. Meanwhile, Ottoman forces attempted to undermine the defenses by digging tunnels, but they were stopped, conducted naval blockades, and constructed siege towers, and many other things. Despite severe bombardment, the defenders held out for nearly 2 months. And basically, it had to do with those walls that we mentioned. They were a phenomenon, basically, for 1,000 years. Emperor Constantine XI fought bravely, even as morale flagged and supplies dwindled. On May 29th, Mehmed launched a final massive assault. After hours of fierce fighting, a breach was made. And many of you have heard about this breach, the gate that was opened. We don't know if the gate just happened to open. We don't know if somebody was inside that opened it. No one knows really what took place. But it was that breach. It wasn't a bombardment of the walls. It was that breach that they came through and basically took over the city. Ottoman forces poured into the city. While some accounts describe, there was widespread looting and killing, obviously, because during that particular time, as you know, if you did not surrender up front, there was a few days, obviously, that they allowed the troops to take whatever they could, slaves, whatever, and then at the appropriate time, everything fell back to the Sultan. Mehmed reportedly, as a matter of fact, he reportedly intervened in the hold of the worst excesses, and in the end he claimed Hagia Sophia as a mosque. And Constantinople obviously became the Ottoman capital and the center of Islamic civilization. So before we talked about the Eastern Roman Empire, but now we have Constantinople again becoming the center of a civilization, but this time the center of Islamic civilization. A little bit about the strategy of Mehmed II after the fall. And it shows you to a certain degree how crafty he was to a certain degree. He appointed Gennadios Scholarios as the patriarch. He appointed him as the patriarch. After the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed II strategically appointed him because he was a staunch anti-unionist. In other words, he didn't want union of the two churches, and prominent Orthodox theologian. And he proclaimed him as the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. Gennadios was vigorously opposed the union with Rome, and was widely respected among the Orthodox faithful for his theological rigor and defense of Orthodox tradition. What did Mehmed do by appointing Gennadios? First of all, he positioned himself as the protector of the Orthodox Christianity, legitimizing its rule over the predominantly Christian population. Don't forget, many people said better the Ottomans or taking over than the Cardinals' mitre. If you remember that saying by famous people from Constantinople. Mehmed II manipulated religious politics after 1453, and it was, to a certain degree, a masterstroke of imperial strategy. By embracing the Orthodox Church and elevating its anti-Latin leader, he not only pacified a conquered population, but also strengthened the divide between East and West, ensuring political stability and religious loyalty under Ottoman rule. What am I saying? What I'm saying is he positioned himself as a defender of orthodoxy. Okay? People in the East, the Orthodox East, many of them did not want at all union. They did not want at all to abandon the Orthodox faith. In doing so, he transformed himself from a conqueror of Christians, to a certain degree, to a legitimate sovereign in the eyes of many Orthodox believers, securing the empire's foundation for centuries. One thing we learn is that you can't keep people under captivity. Okay, they'll rebel against you. But if you become a supporter of them, okay, they become part of you. So there's many reasons why the Orthodox stayed with the Ottoman Empire. And many times, I say this as a joke sometimes, when people say about the Ottoman Empire, we were, to a certain degree, part of the Ottoman Empire. We were, to a certain degree, the Ottomans. Okay, because without us, without the economy which we controlled, there would have been, and also the troops that we had, there wouldn't have been an Ottoman Empire that would have lasted that long in Hellas. The fall of Constantinople was an international event, like we said. It was a major, pivotal date. The fall of Constantinople is recognized as the movement, okay, between the Middle Ages and the more modern age. That is the pivotal moment that history books talk about. So it was the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the Roman Empire. I will indicate, I'll go back just 1 second. After Constantinople fell, there were two empires left, there were two groups left that were still controlled by the Eastern Romans. One of them was the Moria, the other one was Trapezunda. And the Moria fell in 1460. Okay, it fell 7 years after Constantinople did. And it fell because of Mehmet, again because of Mehmet. Constantine the 11th was the despot of the Moria before he became the emperor. And his two brothers, Thomas and Dimitrios, became the leaders of that particular area. And part of the problem that happened is after the fall of Constantinople, the brothers fought with each other, by the way, and that basically led to a situation where Mehmet went into the Moria and basically invaded the despotate of the Moria. They fought. And as a matter of fact, their battles are in history books. And the final battle was actually in the fort of Leondari, which is on the hill. It's not where the Leondari is right now. And with that, one of the brothers became Islamatized. One of the brothers decided to go with Mehmet, and Mehmet gave him a few islands, let's say, that he had. The other brother, Thomas, left with some of the troops, and they went to the west. They went through Patra. They took the skull of St. Andrew, and Thomas sold it basically to the Pope. Okay, and now for those who go to Patra, the Pope did give back some of the fragments of the head. That's why in Patra now we see the head of St. Andrew, and he also gave a piece of some of the bones, etc., to Scotland. The beginning of the Ottoman Empire's golden age from this period would dominate. The city at that time when it fell was again, a minor city, really. By the time of 1453, there weren't that many people living in the city. There were about 40, maybe 40,000 or what have you. And Mehmet actually brought in, this sounds crazy, Mehmet brought in Hellenes. He brought in Hellenes into the city from the Peloponnesus, for example, from other parts, etc., to populate the city. It's not in my notes, but this is something that's quite frankly fascinating. And now, what did it also do? What it did is, when the Ottomans basically took over this area, it closed the key land trade routes between the east and the west. The Ottomans closed the land routes. Before, there used to be trade between the Eastern Romans and, let's say, as far as China. But those particular links were closed at that particular time. And what did it do to the west? It prompted European powers to seek maritime alternatives. And that's what sparked the age of exploration in the West. When we look at the West and we say, well, why in the West all of a sudden they start to search to see how they can get to China, etc., etc., because the East had been blocked by the Ottomans to them. Also, what happened with the fall of the city, a massive diaspora of Hellenic scholars went to Italy and Western Europe, bringing with them ancient texts and ideas that fueled the Renaissance. When we talk about the Western Renaissance, it came from the East. It came from these Hellenic people that were in the East, that were in Constantinople and other parts of what was the Eastern Roman Empire, and basically they went to the West and created and fueled the Renaissance. It wouldn't have existed without them. Also, people maybe don't know, but there was a military diaspora, that changed warfare in the West, particularly in the use of Romanic slapiotes. Okay, well, I think in one of the future lectures I'll talk about the Stathakion and what they did actually in the West, who served as mercenaries and defended Western states, including in particular Venice. It was the Stathakion, the Greek soldiers, who basically saved Venice, and why an Orthodox church was allowed to be built in Venice. When you talk about St. George, I don't know if any of you have visited it, the reason why it was allowed within a Roman Catholic country to have an Orthodox church was because of the Stathakion and the cavalry who were feared throughout Europe during that particular time. The solidification of the Orthodox world's cultural identity around the memory of Constantinople, fall and the dream, and the eventual restoration. In other words, that didn't fade. Let's talk a little bit about the memory of 1453 and the road to 1821. Though politically destroyed, the idea of Rome Rossini lived on in the Orthodox imagination. The dream of the conquest of Constantinople, or at least the liberation of Christian lands from Ottoman rule, became a central theme in Hellenic culture and popular religion. Hellenic rebellions against Ottoman rule were numerous, persistent, and deeply rooted in the desire to reclaim independence. Orthodox, not only independence, but Orthodox Christian identity and Hellenic heritage. These uprisings span nearly 4 centuries, reflecting the resilience of the Hellenic people under foreign domination. Many times people look at history and say, okay, 1453, Constantinople fell, and then the next thing in history is the revolution of 1821. It's just not true. It's just not true. In the centuries that followed, revolts broke out on a constant basis and included numerous Hellenic uprisings, and including, obviously, later on, the rise of Celtic resistance in the mountains. The Megadi there, the vision of reviving the Hellenic state with Constantinople as its capital, emerged in the 19th century, but had roots in the memory of 1453. Let's talk a little bit about those rebellions and some of the resistance that many people don't talk about, but maybe we'll start talking about it going forward. We had various Peloponnesian revolts from the 1450s to the 1460s after the fall of Constantinople. Hellenes and the Peloponnese resisted Ottoman advances, and the Peloponnese dynasty in Astoria, for example, I mentioned earlier, didn't fall until 1460. The other thing is this. When we talk about 1460, we look at the history books, and 1460, boom, all of a sudden the Monarch was under Ottoman rule. That also is not correct, because it was fighting all along. When you look at the tax records, the Ottoman tax records, which were meticulous, there are certain regions within the Monarch that actually had no tax records. What that implies, and many historians are saying, is that there were many parts of the Monarch that actually did not fall until almost 100 years later, from 1460. In Himara, which is Dorio Epirus, and Epirus, our Epirus that we talk about, uprisings took place in 1479 to the 1490s. Many people, see Skanderbeg as just being Albanian. Okay, they see it as Albanian. Or Katsos, for example. But understand, his father was Orthodox. His father had actually created a small geli, or whatever you want to call it, in Mount Athos. Okay, it's called the Albanian, monastery or what have you, which is now in ruins. But his father was Orthodox. He was Hellenic Orthodox. And Katsos himself, even though they say and they talk about him as being a Roman Catholic, the reality is he wasn't. The reality was it ties back into what we were talking about before the Council of Florence. There was confusion in that in-between period about union and non-union. Revolts in Epirus took place in Western Greece. They were tied to Venetian and in many cases Spanish efforts. but they had tremendous support from Hellenic leaders. Hellenic support took place in many different cases. And for example, we're talking about the Ottoman-Venetian wars. Every one of the wars that Venice fought in, even though they talk about Venice all the time, Venice did this, Venice did that, Venice controlled this, Venice controlled that. Who were their soldiers? Many of their soldiers were in fact Hellenic Orthodox Christians. And these are some of the wars that we're talking about, whether it's 1463, or 1479, or 1499 to 1503, the Stathakion was still around during that particular time. And Hellenes were actually allied with some Venetians and rose with arms locally. Thank you so much. We go into the 17th and 18th centuries also. The rebellions that were taking place in Crete. And all these Ottoman and Venetian wars, okay, they involved Hellenes throughout. There were Peloponnesian revolts in 1659 to 1669. But also, when they talk about Morosini in 1685, for example, coming back and taking over the Moria for a period of time, from about 1685 to about 1715, when they eliminated the Ottomans from the Moria, who was there with them? They don't mention who was there, who were some of the soldiers. They were in fact Hellenic soldiers. And just this as a side note, but part of the reason why the Ottomans came in after 1715 in the Moria had to do with the Venetians taxing them more than the Ottomans did. And actually the Hellenic people in Moria didn't really care if the Ottomans came back so they could pay less taxes than they were paying to the Venetians. So in the 18th century, we have different influences. Some of them Russian. We talk about the Orlov Revolt. Okay, in 1770, Orlov, the Orlov brothers, the so-called lovers of Queen Catherine. If you don't mind, thank you. The Orlov Revolt, everybody thought that the Russians would come. The Russians, in fact, were not coming. And in fact, there was a major revolt and caused tremendous upheaval, obviously, throughout the Peloponnese in particular. There were Klavchuk and Armatogi resistance, armed bands and militias, waging local resistance in mountainous regions continuously. They became enduring symbols of resistance. Then we had a period, obviously, of what we call the Hellenic Enlightenment during the 18th century, influenced by European Enlightenment. Diaspora Greeks like Vigas Fereas, for example, promoted nationalism. And his execution in 1798 made him a martyr. Vigas' original thought process was and the Charti, what they call the Vigas Fereas Charta, really did not envision just liberating what is now known as Hellas, or currently the Republic of Greece, but his thought process was to liberate all of the Balkans, all of what is now Hellas, even into areas that are now part of Turkey, particularly the western coastline. And that was his thought process. That was the thought process of Vigas. So the prelude was the Hellenic environment in Enlightenment, and also obviously the Stathakion that we know about, the secret society that was formed at Odessa by Hellenic merchants and intellectuals, and it laid the groundwork for national revolt in the hopes of foreign support. When the revolution, by the way, took place, and I think I have to mention because the Yarsumoya representatives are here. One of their own, obviously, was the only head of the Stathakion starting the revolt of 1821. He's not mentioned many times. Panayotis Sekeris, that you know of, is not mentioned. He should be a national hero. But like all people who many times support Hellas, they become impoverished, but that's a separate story which we'll discuss in the future. The spark of 1821 culminated in centuries of revolt. The Hellenic War of Independence, which began obviously in 1821, had all types of heroes, and then finally independence was recognized in 1830. Though many uprisings were crushed, they preserved national identity and laid the foundation for liberation. Faith, folklore, and memory kept the dream of freedom alive. By the early 1800s, as we indicated, Filikia Beria, Enlightenment, the revolutionaries saw themselves as spiritual heirs of the Romani and invoked the memory of Constantine XI, who became a martyr. Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor, was revered in Hellenic folklore as the Marmelos Vasilias, the marble emperor, a figure who would awaken and restore the empire, a legend that reflected the belief that he did not die, but he was turned into marble and awaits a divine call to reclaim Constantinople and the Romaic Empire. The phrase, Pagi men chronos mekelus, once more with time and season, became a motto of hope, suggesting that Constantinople would one day return to Christian rule. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just the end of a city or an empire. It was the conclusion of the ancient Roman world and the birth of a new modern order. It reshaped geography, commerce, religion, and global power structures. While the Ottomans inherited the imperial mantle of the East, the West turned towards the sea and the New World. Yet in the heart of Orthodox Christians, especially Hellenes, the city never fell. It lived as a symbol of lost glory, faith under siege, and a future redemption. This persistent memory helped inspire a national awakening that culminated in the founding of the modern Greek state in the 19th century, nearly 4 centuries later. Zito Yalas.
Και τώρα, πριν δώσουμε τον λόγο στον επόμενο μιλητή μας, αξίζει να σημειώσουμε ότι πρόκειται για έναν άνθρωπο με μακρά πορεία και βαθιά σύνδεση με τον ελληνισμό της Διασποράς, έναν πραγματικό αφηγητή μνήμης και προσφοράς, ο κύριος Stathakion. Γεννημένος στην Κωνσταντινούπολη, μεγάλωσε στην Αθήνα και τα τελευταία 46 χρόνια ζει μόνιμα στη Νέα Υόρκη. Με μακρά και επιτυχημένη πορεία στον χώρο της ελληνικής ναυτιλίας, υπηρέτησε επί σχεδόν 5 δεκαετίες ως ναυλομεσίτης, από όπου και συνταξιοδοτή και πρόσφατα. Παράλληλα, τα τελευταία 35 χρόνια αποτελεί ενεργό μέλος και αφιλοκερδός εθελοντής στον ελληνικό κοινοφελές ραδιόφωνο Κόσμος FM, προσφέροντας ακούραστα στην προώθηση της διατήρησης της ελληνικής γλώσσας και του πολιτισμού στην ομογένεια. Σήμερα θα μοιραστεί μαζί μας πολύτιμες αναμνήσεις από την πόλη που γεννήθηκε, τη Βασιλεύουσα. Μέσα από τη δική του βιωματική βαθιά, δηλώνει με περηφάνεια Κωνσταντινοπολίτης, Αθηναίος και Νεοκαίζος. Ο κύριος Stathakion.
Η κυρία Κωστάκη μου ζήτησε να μοιραστώ μερικές μνήμες από τα χρόνια στην Κωνσταντινούπολη. Όπως βλέπετε δεν έγραψα τίποτα, δεν έχω σημειώσεις, γιατί οι μνήμες είναι χαραγμένες στο σκληρό δίσκο του εγκεφάλου. Δεν χρειάζονται ούτε σημειώσεις, ούτε λογίδρια. Η ισχυρότερη μνήμη που έχω από την Κωνσταντινούπολη είναι η τελευταία μέρα. Είναι η αναχώρηση. Λίγο πριν τα έκτα μου γενέθλια, τον Ιούλιο του 1963, ο πατέρας μου είχε φύγει από την Κωνσταντινούπολη 3 μήνες πριν για να πάει στην Αθήνα να ετοιμάσει, να βρει σπίτι, να βρει μαγαζί, ήταν εμπορογράφης, να ετοιμάσει τέλος πάντων την κατάσταση ώστε η μητέρα μου, ο αδελφός μου και εγώ, όταν ήταν όλα έτοιμα να πάμε να τον βρούμε. Και έτσι, μία ζεστή μέρα του Ιουλίου του 1963, ήρθε ο θείος Γιώργος, ήταν ο πλούσιος θείος της οικογένειας, κάθε οικογένεια έχει ένα πλούσιο θείο συνήθως, ήρθε με το Mercedes, στα τατάβλα που μέναμε, μαζί με μια καμιονέτα με 2 Τούρκους χαμάλιδες για να πάρουν τα μπαγκάζια και μας πήγε στο λιμάνι. Θυμάμαι, όταν αντίκρισα αυτό που μου φάνηκε τότε τεράστιο άσπρο πλοίο, το Ακτενής, που σημαίνει λευκή θάλασσα, συνηθισμένος εγώ από τα μικρά πλοιάρια που έβλεπα που πηγαίναμε στην Κάλκη, στην Πρίγκιπο, στην Πρώτη, βλέπω αυτό το τεράστιο πλοίο που μου έκανε τεράστια εντύπωση. Μέχρι την τρελή χαρά εγώ, που πάμε στην Αθήνα, πάμε να βρούμε τον πατέρα μου, κοιτάζω και βλέπω όλη την οικογένεια εκεί, οι αδελφές της μητέρας μου, οι αδελφοί του πατέρα μου, ο παππούς, η γιαγιά, να κλαίνε με μαύρο δάκρυ, να αγκαλιάζουνε, να μας αγκαλιάζουνε μέσα στα κλάματα, να κλαίνει η μητέρα μου. Και εγώ να λέω, μα τι κλαίνουν όλοι αυτοί. Πάμε ταξίδι, πάμε να βρούμε τον πατέρα μου και κλαίνε. Ανεβαίνουμε τη σκάλα, μας πάει ο καμαρότος στην καμπίνα, τακτοποιούμαστε και μετά πάμε στο κατάστρωμα για την αναχώρηση. Κάτω μια θάλασσα από άσπρα μαντήλια να κουνιούνται, 3 μακριά σφυρίγματα του φουγγάρου, λύνουν τους κάδους και αρχίζει το πλοίο σιγά σιγά να φεύγει. Κοιτάζω από το γαλατά που εκεί κάτω από το γαλατά ήταν το λιμάνι και βλέπω στο κέντρο του οπτικού μου πεδίου τον Τρούλο της Αγίας Σοφιάς να απομακρύνεται. Και κοιτάζω τη μητέρα μου και βλέπω τα δάκρυά της να τρέχουν και να κάνουν λιμνούλες πάνω στο ξύλο του καταστρώματος. Και αναρωτιέμαι πάλι, μα γιατί κλαίει αυτή η γυναίκα? Πάμε στην Ελλάδα. Πέρασαν πολλά χρόνια. Όταν έγινα έφηβος, τώρα δεν θυμάμαι, 13, 14, 15 χρονών, που κατάλαβα επιτέλους τι έγινε εκείνη την ημέρα. Τότε κατάλαβα πως αυτό που εγώ νόμιζα ένα ευχάριστο ταξίδι ήταν η αναγκαστική αποχώρηση από τον τόπο σου. Ήταν η αποχώρηση από τον τόπο σου παρά τη θέλησή σου και το αίσθημα ότι από το κατάστρωμα του Αρτεμής βλέπεις την πόλη που μάλλον δεν θα την ξαναδείς. Τότε κατάλαβα το δάκρυ της μητέρας μου. Και αυτή είναι η πιο δυνατή μνήμη. Αλλά δεν θέλω να σας στενοχωρήσω, είχαμε και ευχάριστα πράγματα, είχαμε πολύ ευχάριστα πράγματα. Κάτι που θυμάμαι πολύ έντονα και ίσως το θυμάμαι γιατί είχε επαναληπτικότητα, γινόταν σχεδόν κάθε εβδομάδα, ήταν το κυριακάτικο τραπέζι. Μεγάλη δουλειά το κυριακάτικο τραπέζι. Πηγαίναμε στην εκκλησία και όταν γυρνούσαμε, το τραπέζι γινόταν πάντα στο σπίτι του παππού και της γιαγιάς, στο Τζιχαγκύρ. Οι πολίτες εδώ ξέρουν τι εννοώ. Και με το που γυρνούσαμε από την εκκλησία, οι γυναίκες μπαίναν στην κουζίνα, το τραπέζι στρωμένο με το τραπεζομάντιλο το λινό που δεν είχε φρεσκοσυδερωμένο ούτε μία τσάκιση, τα καλά σερβίτσια, τα κρυστάλλινα ποτήρια και πάντα είχαμε επισκέπτες. Ποτέ δεν είχαμε κυριακάτικο φαγητό χωρίς επισκέπτες. Ο παππούς μου ήταν πάρα πολύ συνδεδεμένος στενά με το Πατριαρχείο. Και πάντα είχαμε ιερείς, επισκόπους, μητροπολίτες, ιεροψάλτες σαν επισκέπτες. Ο Τράλεον, ο Χαλκιδόνος, ο Προύσης, όλους τους μητροπολίτες πάντα τους αναφέραμε με την μητρόπολη τους, ποτέ με το όνομά τους. Εγώ μικρό παιδί βέβαια δεν το ήξερα αυτό. Μια μέρα μου είπαν χαιρέστε το σεβασμιότατο. Του φυλάω το χέρι όπως μου είχαν μάθει και του λέω χαίρετε κύριε Προύση. Λοιπόν, και σε λίγο άρχιζαν να βγαίνουν οι μεζέδες. Λακέρδες, τσίρι, αντσούγες, παστούρμας, σουτζούκια, σιγάρ μπουρέκ, τα μπουρεκάκια τα στρογγυλά, φασόλια πιάζι. Βασίλη, τα θυμάμαι έτσι, αυτά δεν ήτανε. Μεζέδες, γέμιζε το τραπέζι, μελιτζανοσαλάτα, πολύτιμη μελιτζανοσαλάτα, οπωσδήποτε, τουρσιά, αλαντικά, τυριά. Και μετά ανοίγανε το ντούζικο. Το ντούζικο είναι το ούζο. Το γιατί το λέγαμε ντούζικο στην πόλη, δεν ξέρω. Οι Τούρκοι το λέγανε ρακί. Εμείς το λέγαμε ντούζικο. Του παππού μου το αγαπημένο ήταν το γεννήρακ. Και αρχίζανε το ούζο, και αρχίζαν τους μεζέδες, γέλια, χαρές, πειράγματα. Εμείς παιδιά βέβαια δεν καθόμασταν πολύ στο τραπέζι, γιατί αυτή η διαδικασία κρατούσε μέχρι το βράδυ, οπότε βαριόμασταν. Αλλά πηγαίναμε, παίζαμε, ερχόμασταν, αλλά βλέπαμε την οικογένεια, βλέπαμε τους επισκέπτες να χαίρονται. Και όταν φτάνανε στο κέφι, αντί να αρχίσουν να τραγουδάνε, ξέρω κι εγώ, την Ιτιά ή το άλλα τραγούδια, αρχίσαν τις ψαλμοδίες. Άντε στα Νίτσα, ο Θρασίβουλος Στανίτσας που ήταν πολύ καλός φίλος του παππού μου, άντε στα Νίτσα πιάσε ένα χερουβικό. Άντε Πετρόχυλο πιάσε το Άγιος, ο Κύριος. Και αρχίζαν τις ψαλμοδίες και θυμάμαι εγώ παιδί τις μελωδικές αυτές φωνές. Ήταν και ο παππούς μου καλήφωνος. Και μετά αρχίζαν τα φαγητά, γιατί μέχρι τώρα ήταν τα μεζεκλίκια. Τους μεζέδες τους λέγαμε μεζεκλίκια. Και μετά ήρθαν τα φαγητά. λαχανοδολμάδες, χουμικάρπελεντή, τα πιλάτια. Δεν μπορείς να κάνεις πολίτικο τραπέζι χωρίς πιλάτι. Την πολίτικη κουζίνα πιστεύω πως οι περισσότεροι την έχουμε δει. Και το γυρίζανε μετά στις κατάτες, ετείναξε την αφισμένη κουταλιά και όλα αυτά τα παλιά τραγούδια. Αυτή η χαρά, αυτή η όμορφη ατμόσφαιρα ήταν κάτι το αξέχαστο. Και φυσικά στο τέλος, είχε γίνει από τη μία που αρχίζαμε, είχε πιάσει 8, ξέρω και 7 ώρες πάνω στο τραπέζι, αρχίζανε τα εκμέκ, αρχίζανε τα ραβανί, αρχίζανε όλα τα γλυκά. Και όπως καταλαβαίνετε, έχω μια σχέση ιδιαίτερη με το φαγητό. Και θυμάμαι, αυτό είναι μια από τις μνήμες, γιατί γινόταν σχεδόν κάθε Κυριακή. Ήταν μια ευχάριστη μνήμη. Νόμιζα πως δεν είχα άλλες μνήμες, δεν θυμόμουν άλλα πράγματα. Μέχρι το 2012, δηλαδή 49 χρόνια αργότερα από εκεί την ημέρα που το Άκη σιγά σιγά έφυγε από το Βόσπορο, όταν με ευλόγησε ο Θεός να ξαναπάω στην πόλη μετά από σχεδόν 50 χρόνια, και με το που την πρώτη μέρα πήγαμε στα Τατάβλα και πήγαμε στον Άγιο Δημήτριο, την εκκλησία της Ανορίας μας, που δεν θυμόμουν. Αν μου έλεγες περιέγραψέ μας στην εκκλησία σου, δεν είχα ιδέα. Με το που μπήκα όμως στον Άγιο Δημήτριο, αμέσως ήρθαν όλα στη μνήμη. Αμέσως θυμήθηκα τα πάντα. Με το που περάσαμε απέναντι και πήγαμε στο σύλλογο, που ο πατέρας μου ήταν στο σύλλογο των Τεταβιανών, που ήταν αθλητικός και θεατρικός και ένας κοινοτικός σύλλογος, όπως έχουμε εδώ στις κοινότητες. Με το που πήγαμε στο σύλλογο, αμέσως θυμήθηκα που μικροί πηγαίναμε να εντοπίσουμε τον πατέρα μου να έρθει σπίτι να φάμε. Όλες οι εικόνες μου ήρθαν πάλι πίσω. Όλες οι μνήμες που κάπου είχαν χωθεί βαθιά, μου ήρθαν πάλι πίσω. Θυμάμαι όταν πήγαμε στη Χάλκη και το πλοίο της γραμμής έπιασε το λιμάνι και βγήκαμε στο ΚΕ, στην Αποβάθρα. Με το που είδα τα καφενεία εκεί στο ΚΕ, αμέσως είδα τον νονό μου και τους φίλους του να κάθονται στο τραπέζι με τους ναργιλέδες και εγώ πιτσιρικάς να πηγαίνω, γιατί μου άρεσε να ακούω το γκουρουρουρουρουρ που κάνει ο ναργιλές όταν τον πίνεις. Και μετά παίρνοντας το αμαξάκι να πάμε στη σχολή, ανεβαίνοντας τον κύριος δρόμο, με το που στρίβει το αμαξάκι για τη σχολή, βλέπω το σπίτι της γιαγιάς μου. Κανένας δεν μου είχε πει πως εκεί είναι το σπίτι της γιαγιάς μου. Αλλά μόλις το είδα, το θυμήθηκα. Τι παιχνίδια, τι ωραίες στιγμές είχαμε περάσει στο σπίτι της γιαγιάς στη Χάλκη. Όλες λοιπόν αυτές οι μνήμες και αργότερα και άλλα στο Σισλί, στο Ταξίν, πήγα στο μαγαζί του νονού μου χωρίς να ξέρω πως ήταν το μαγαζί του νονού μου, είχε πυραρία, όπως το λέγανε, εστιατόριο. Και μπαίνω μέσα και λέω αυτό το μαγαζί κάτι μου θυμίζει. Δεν ήξερα. Λέω λες να είναι το μαγαζί του νονού. Και παίρνω τηλέφωνο μια ξαδέλφη μου που ήξερε που είχε μείνει και λέω είμαι στο... Πώς το λέω το πασάζ αυτό με τα λουλούδια, Βασίλη, το τσιτσάκ πασαζί. Είμαι στο τσιτσάκ πασαζί, λέω και είναι ένα εστιατόριο. Μου λέει αυτό είναι το εστιατόριο του νονού σου. Αμέσως ήρθε στη μνήμη. Οι μνήμες λοιπόν είναι κάτι που καταχωνιάζουν μέσα μας, μικροί, και κατά κάποιο τρόπο θαυματουργό ξαναβγαίνουν όταν δοθεί το ερέθισμα. Δεν μεγαλώσαμε γνωρίζοντας ότι μας διώξαν από τον τόπο μας, αλλά χωρίς μίσος. Η καλύτερη φίλη της μητέρας μου, η Λεμάν, ήταν Τουρκίσα, Τουρκάλα, αδελφικές φίλες. Φορούσε, όταν φύγαμε από την πόλη, φορούσε μαύρα για 6 μήνες από τη στεναχώρια της. Μάθαμε ότι οι άνθρωποι, είτε είναι Έλληνες, είτε Τούρκοι, είτε Αμερικάνοι, είτε Αλβανοί, έτσι μεγαλώσαμε, είναι άνθρωποι. Και μάθαμε πως οι σκοπιμότητες, οι πολιτικές, οι σκοπιμότητες των κυβερνήσεων, των οικονομικών συμφερόντων, δεν έχουν σχέση με τις ανθρώπινες σχέσεις. Θεωρώ τον εαυτό μου ευλογημένο που γεννήθηκα σε αυτόν τον τόπο. Θυμάμαι την πρώτη φορά που συναντήθηκα στη Χάλκη με τον τότε επίσκοπο Κρούσης Ελπιδοφόρο. Μου είχε πει: έχεις στον νόμο σου βαριά κληρονομιά, γιατί γεννήθηκες στη Βόρεια. Και την αισθάνομαι αυτή τη βαριά κληρονομιά. Μπορεί να ξέρω πως πάλι με χρόνιων καιρούς μάλλον δεν θα είναι δικιά μας, αλλά για μένα είναι δικιά μας. Γιατί όποτε πάω στην πόλη, και από τότε, από το 12, κάθε φορά που είμαι στην Ελλάδα, κλέβω 3-4 μέρες. Αυτό που ξέχασα, είδες οι μνήμες. Θυμάμαι τη συγκίνηση όταν πήγα στο νεκροταφείο του Αγίου Ελευθερίου και είδα τον τάφο με το όνομα του παππού μου, της γιαγιάς μου και του μεγάλου μου αδελφού, ο οποίος πέθανε βρέφος, Αλέξανδρος Στακετζής. Και σκέφτηκα, κατάλαβα εκείνη τη στιγμή τι σημαίνει να έχεις ρίζες και τι σημαίνει να έχεις επαφή με τις ρίζες σου. Έχω πάει τις κόρες μου επανειλημμένα στην Κωνσταντινούπολη για να ξέρουν τις ρίζες της οικογένειας και για μας η πόλη είναι δικιά μας. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.